Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to have two excellent speakers to speak on rural America in the age of COVID, myths, realities, and a way forward. So without further ado, why don't I go ahead and introduce our speakers. The first one is Katherine Ferguson. She's the Associate Director of the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, and she'll be followed by Rob Riley, President of the Northern Forest Center. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Katherine, and thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Pleasure. Hello, everyone. Nice to, well, I can't see you, but thanks for joining us this afternoon or or morning, depending on where you are. I am in Colorado and going to share my screen as we get started here. So as noted, we are going to, my colleague Rob Riley with the Northern Forest Center and I are going to talk a little bit about rural America, and particularly we'll try and center it now in the age of COVID, and know that rural America is just full of myths, there are lots of myths about rural America, and we want to make sure that we provide an opportunity to have really candid conversation about those myths, about realities, and what it really will take to build a stronger nation as we do the work of building back and building back better in a way that includes rural and tribal communities. So with that, let me give you just a little bit of a sense of what our plan is for this time. And be nice if the slide, there we go. So our plan here, we have 4 objectives to today. So one, we want to share some data to start. That's what I'm going to do. That helps to bust some of these rural myths and help make sure you really have a ground truth and an understanding of some real facts about rural America. We want to provide some insight, mostly through our discussion, about how an urban-centric bias can creep into policy and narratives, and what we could do about that. We want to make whatever concepts and data that I'm talking about really concrete, and that is why it's so important and just great that we have Rob Riley here with us from the Northern Forest Center, which you'll hear more about in a little bit. And then we just want to have a candid conversation with you. So start writing down your questions. There's no question too simple, no question too complex. We just want to put it all out on the table. So here to the right is our agenda. You can see a look. We're going to start with some data. We'll hear a little bit about the Northern Forest Center. Then John, Rob, and I will talk a little bit and together, and then we'll open it up for everyone else. So with that, let's forge ahead. And I'm going to start, as I mentioned, with some time on data. So what do we really know about rural America? Who is rural America? And really here, I want to these are basic facts. So 19.3% of the population lives in rural, and that's about 60 million people, or approximately 1 in 5 Americans. So we'll come back to the polling question on this. Ooh, sorry, I just am perched, so I have my internet plugged in, so I can not lose you. Let's see, so we have 20%, approximately 20% of the US population in rural places. We have about 70% here, 68% of counties in the United States are rural. And the reason I share that is that we often focus on cities when making policy, but when it comes down to numbers, the number of police districts, the number of small municipalities, the number of governments, rural is actually a majority in certain ways. And so we need to, I think that's really a call for us to pay attention in our policy making to all of these rural places. 97% of the US land area is rural counties. And then of course, water, energy, food, open space are inherently rural. So this goes to this polling question about how many people live in rural. What is rural? What are we really talking about here? And really, rural is defined typically as non-metropolitan or non-urban. So part of our challenge here with understanding what we're talking about is we're often talking in a deficit. We're talking about what's not a city. And so measurements of rural just range. So whether you answered 43 million or 60 million, whether you said 14% of the population or 19% of the population, Whether you said it depends or all of the above, you're right. What is rural is a constant source of tension. There are actually 8 definitions of rural, if not more, all within the Department of Agriculture and the Rural Development Division of the Department of Agriculture. So this is a place where there's a lot of confusion, which is challenging for policymaking. But in part, what usually I think about is the people who live in rural places people know it. When they see it, they know it. And that's not great for policymaking, but for practical purposes in our conversation today, that will usually be enough. I'll show you a map briefly to give you this sense. And the big takeaway I would say here is that rural and rurality is very relative. There, you can see there are just many different kinds of rural. So we go back to this particular map, you can see here, you have places that are very dense, you have places that are really very rural, and there's even a term where there's remote, and there's even frontier. So if you're thinking about communities, say in far Alaska, they might be frontier communities, not near a city in any way, shape, or form. And of course, there are lots of rural places that are right near metropolitan centers, and some of those are really rapidly growing. I think it's pretty interesting in part because many places that are at one time urban or rural, if they grow a little bit, in the next census, they end up being classified as urban. So part of why you hear these numbers about rural consistently emptying out, of course, it depends on where you are, but it's also related to change in population growth and how we classify. So the big takeaway here is when we say rural, it's really important to remember that there are many different kinds of rural. And so that was this is a map here of all of these places across the country that were all just recently categorized via a project called the American Communities Project that put communities all into different categories, and you can just see that diversity. So a few more facts here. So here we have the number of people living in rural America has increased 11% this is just the raw number, right? We hear about rural places depopulating, but really they've increased, that the raw numbers increased over the course of 1970 to 2010. So fun fact you might not have known. Also really important, and this again is busting myths, agriculture actually employs less than 5% of the rural workforce today. So still incredibly important in the rural economy, particularly in certain regions, but only 5% of the rural workforce. People of color comprised 83% of rural population growth between 2000 and 2010. Just tremendous, right? That is the demographic. These are the demographics that are driving growth in rural, even though we often think about rural as white, and it certainly is predominantly white, whiter than the rest of the country in certain regions in particular, but that is changing and changing quickly. And then it's important to realize it is true that the rural poverty rate is higher in rural than in urban areas, and that's especially true for children. So I mentioned this earlier, but this again, let's bust a myth. So the prevailing fact is that the prevailing wisdom is that many rural places are shrinking. Well, and this is partially true. You hear about outmigration, but in reality, it's just very different. Some places are growing, some places are shrinking. And you can see this map to the right that shows population growth over the course of time and places where population has declined. And really every state has some places that have grown and some places that have declined in recent history. Again, I mentioned rural economies are not necessarily just about agriculture, but increasingly diverse. And I think that this is really important to think about when we're trying to figure out what policy actually makes sense in rural places. And today, as you can see, the rural economy is increasingly like the urban economy, with a growing service sector, growing emphasis on leisure, hospitality, where you think about places that are shifting maybe from an economy that might have been focused on manufacturing or agriculture, and today are moving towards outdoor recreation and other services, retirement communities. So that diversity of the rural economy is super important to keep in mind, and not necessarily reflective of what our rural policy that was often created in the 1860s and 1930s really looks like today. As I mentioned, rural demographics are changing, and here are just some figures. Certainly in many places, immigrants are the really driving place where you see the demographic, the groups who are moving in, and you've seen, their communities. Often we've heard about a lot of these communities recently in the context of COVID. Towns in Kansas, right, where maybe they have a meatpacking plant, and meatpacking has historically been and remains a business, an industry where immigrant and migrant labor is very much used, and that's true a lot in agriculture. So you see lots of people who are coming to America and living in rural places where the cost of living might be a little bit lower, their jobs, and that's fundamentally changing the demographics and the dynamics in many rural places. Again, you can see people of color increasingly predominant in particular counties in particular. And then veterans have always been an important population and continue to be an important component of the demographics of rural places. So finally, I want to mention here that rural counties there's just a really big overlay between persistent poverty counties. So that's places that have had a poverty rate of at least 20% for the last 30 years. And you can see that the majority of persistent poverty counties in America are rural. They are also predominantly communities and counties where the population is people of color. So we have this overlay between place and race and class in America we don't always talk about, but it really shows up in rural policy and needs to show up in rural policy making. So we often hear about this rural-urban divide, but I think that's, for me, another myth that's really important for us to emphasize and to try to bust, because rural and urban places really form interdependent regions, right? Rural folks often go into the city with frequency, whether it's because they have jobs there or whether they have relationships and families there. Urban folks are heading out for the weekend to recreate, always drinking the water, always relying on the energy, certainly relying on food. You can see this in the way that we live, even though we talk often about this rural and urban divide. We know that we're much more interdependent than that. And I think if we really reframed this urban-rural divide into one of interdependence, it may well affect our policy making. And it's certainly something that other countries have really started to take on. There's been a very vibrant conversation in the EU, in particular, about divergence, regional divergence, and places where economies, you have a modern economy in some place and a much older economy in others, and realizing that the importance of rural-urban connections is both important to the economy and also just society as a whole. So with that, I would just kind of end with the mentioning that rural and urban, again, they're interdependent. Rural places are vibrant, they're creative, they're also diverse, right? There are just so many different rurals. And so I want to turn it over now to Rob to talk about the Northern Forest Center and some of the work that they're doing in the Northeast to help make some of this much more concrete.
Great, thanks, Katherine. Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be on with many of you, and some of you may know this region. Go back one, there we go. I'm sitting right now, or standing in Concord, New Hampshire at sort of the base, and if I look north, to my east, I see the great state of Maine, obviously northern New Hampshire to my north, Vermont, a little bit to my west, and to the farther west is the Adirondack region of New York. That 30 million acre region is what we consider the Northern Forest, and my organization, the Northern Forest Center, has been around for over 23 years, really being a regional innovation and investment partner. And our focus really is creating vibrant places, these communities, as you see here. This is Lancaster, New Hampshire, which sits just north of Franconia Notch. Some of you who may enjoy hiking in the White Mountains might know that specific notch for its access to the mountains. But this small town of 2,500 people is adjacent to the northern White Mountains to its west and to the Connecticut River on its east. And this is the type of community that has historically been forest dependent, dependent in the way that it was relied upon that natural asset for everything in terms of jobs, creating value, manufacturing, even agriculture in this case. And over the generations of people living in rural places, they have changed. In this region, particularly pulp and paper have been the unifying factor along with this landscape. It's both an ecological and an economic region that holds together across these four lines and obviously extends farther north into Canada as well. But as we look across this region, we see generational change. This is an area that is within a day's drive of, depending on who you ask or how fast you drive, between 70 and 100 million people. Many of you may be in the tri-states epicenter there. This is clearly within a day's drive of you all. And our work has really been in supporting communities, nonprofits, businesses, and in our states to be thinking differently about innovation in the rural context in predominantly three different areas. One is within forest-based business innovation. That's how do we create and add sustainable value to this landscape such that we maintain that economic and personal connection between place here. And that really focuses on how do we make furniture, flooring, other wood products that people around the region and across the world consume. And that's out of both native hardwoods that we have here, maple, birch, many others. But we also look at the energy sector here. We are disproportionately the importer of #2 heating oil in the nation, and we have a opportunity to look at sustainable management of our resource for our heating needs. And I will stress heating, and I will not stress electricity, but that's a different conversation. The second area that we will be discussing, or that we work on organizationally, is this notion of destination development. This is beyond providing tourists a nice place to visit. This is about deeply creating an experience that is unique to this landscape, that you can't export to some other place. It involves towns that are welcoming and intimately integrated into their landscape. It involves community businesses and nonprofits working collaboratively around trail development, as well as how does the town itself present and work to create third workspaces, if you will, coffee shops, cafes for people who want to stay, recreate, and be in this place. The third area is community innovation and revitalization. And really this goes to the heart of some of the challenging demographics that relate to a number of things that Katherine shared. We are, according to her data, a graying region. We have suffered population decline, and that has been rooted in economic instability and transition, again, rooted back in how we've used this forest resource. So our focus really is thinking about those three pieces in practice and relaying that work from a grounded perspective up across the regional, within state, to the state level, and then to the national level. Katherine, could you do the next slide, please? What this looks like in practice really is not for you to dive too deeply into, and I think afterwards the team at NYU will share a link to our website where you can look at this. But this essentially is reflecting the 30 million acre region in white. Outside of it is that green, and the dots across this map represent our different programmatic areas. The brownish colors are really around the forest products and forest services area. The green is around targeted communities in which we're working more closely to really focus on some of the driving factors that have resulted and perpetuate the loss of young people, which further the graying of this space. These are ones that are pretty obvious, but also I think go to some of the myths that Katherine pointed out. One of the key ones is the broadband connectivity. Many people take it for granted up in this region, in many rural places. It is not a universal utility. And that is a significant problem that we face that's only been exacerbated in the COVID era. But what I want to do now is kind of take this out of the ether here and off the generalization and focus a bit more. I shared with you a picture of Lancaster. We're going to go to the next slide. I'm going to show you a picture of Millinocket, Maine. This is geographically, actually, Katherine, can you flip back to the last one, please? This is on the screen. You see the farthest right circle. If you can see it, it's very small print, but it says Millinocket, and there's a green circle. That's the location we're talking about. So essentially the geographic center of Maine. If you look to the northwest, you have roughly 2.5 million acres of timberland that used to be owned by Great Northern Paper that was headquartered in Millinocket. And surrounding it is another 11 million acres of forest. As many of you may know, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont are among the top 5, I may say the top 4 in percent forested in the country. So it's a pretty nice land base we have. But Millinocket was really the quintessential mill town. If you'll go to the next slide, Catherine. And this really, I think, if you go back through the socioeconomic trends of this region, you'll see this, that Millinocket was dubbed the Magic City, because essentially overnight it grew out of the wilderness. It had water power, it had fiber, it had proximity to markets, and essentially it became at one point the largest mill of its kind in the country, producing vast volumes of paper and products for the growing East Coast. At the top of this picture, you see Katahdin. Some of you may say, oh, it's Mount Katahdin, but in the native people language, that's redundant because Katahdin means the mountain. So that's providing you my insight, limited as I have to that, but that is called Katahdin. That is, some of you may know, it's the end of the Appalachian Trail. And again, this is an interesting community that grew up on pulp and paper and is now transitioning into holding on to that legacy, but thinking more about that recreation amenity opportunity. So to this infographic in the middle is really about how we're trying to take a concerted, targeted, integrated effort at thinking about the conditions that are necessary for young people to live and thrive in a new generation in these communities. And this isn't about a job. This isn't about your parents were there. This is about a holistic view on what it takes to revitalize a community with what younger people need and want and what they can find elsewhere. Again, I'll repeat that we're not competing for people for jobs. We're competing for their lifestyle, and we have to have these conditions in place. So over the last few years, we have deepened a number of our local partnerships. We have a part-time staff person in this community, and we have taken on partnerships and working to expand broadband, as simple as Wi-Fi hotspots. So if you came in with AT&T service on your phone, you actually have coverage and be able to find maps and things and get around in town. We've provided assistance to local wood products manufacturers. We have supported some local organizations looking at how might they acquire some of the land in this area for a community-owned forest that will be stewarded and driven by community priorities. We've done a number of projects supporting and bringing resources in to expand community facilities. Some of you may or may not know in a very obscure tax credit program called the New Market Tax Credit Financing Program through the CDFI fund. We used that on a very small $2 million deal to renovate the local library. It is one of my proudest projects that we have ever participated in. We've worked on transitioning folks to wood heat away from fossil fuels. We've helped to leverage resources and are starting to build out more mountain bike trail development in town and more connectivity into the community so that people can drive to downtown, park, and then access the great outdoors. We've also pulled together and developed a community revitalization strategy that's been adopted by the town council there, which was a first step for them to accessing other federal funds, CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funds, that otherwise they weren't able to access. So that capacity that we've brought to the community has been significant. The last one I'll mention here is a predominant challenge across rural places, and that is the lack of quality housing stock. We are involved in raising impact investments and have an integrated capital deployment strategy, which basically couples philanthropic investment and tax credit dollars into these properties such that we can provide quality housing for new people looking to participate in this place. And again, we're not competing, or excuse me, we are competing for houses in other places or occupancy and apartments that is not the norm in rural places. We've had to go above and beyond in our investment in 6 different properties and 12 different units, which doesn't sound like a lot, but has shifted the balance of how people are thinking about investing in rural housing and commercial redevelopment in the community. So my point here is all these integrated pieces have to come together at a similar time to address a number of these different issues such that we can start attracting and retaining younger people to rural places who are really want to be there for the lifestyle. The last thing I'll mention is that we really felt about 6 months ago that we were on a glide path to, pretty sustainable and resilient success. And back to the title of, or the series that you're all part of and we're a part of here, in the age of COVID, March 13th, Friday the 13th, actually I was in Millinocket on Thursday the 12th, driving back, trying to understand the events that were transpiring around the globe. On Friday the 13th, we organizationally suspended external meetings, and then the next Monday, pretty much that was going on across the country. But what that in an abstract means to us working virtually had an immediate halting effect on this community. People were not coming to visit and recreate in the last 4 weeks of the winter season. This community in the wintertime is dependent upon snowmobilers, skiers, cross-country skiers, winter bikers, and that had a devastating effect on that significant amount of revenue that this community relies upon. We are still seeing some buoyancy in the real estate market. People who had second homes are staying there. They want to be in rural places as opposed to in urban places. But we also are going to be seeing lower revenues on the town basis, on the county basis, and destabilization of that funding that has been traditionally already weakened by the destabilization of the tax base and the closed mill that is in town. But further, looking at coming out of this is going to be longer and more distant to, I think the population at large, the public's view at large around what recovery looks like in rural places when we have devastating impacts like this. So I'll pause there. I think we want to shift to John and hit a couple of his questions and then shift to the group at large. So thanks for your time on that.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob and Katherine. So yeah, I think I have a couple of things that maybe just the three of us can chat about, and then we'll open it up to the rest. And thank you for those of you that already submitted some questions. And maybe I want to start with kind of, Rob, where you ended very briefly, mentioning that some people who had second homes have chosen to spend the shelter in place in those second homes. And we've seen some reports that people are reconsidering urban lifestyles and thinking about moving out of the city. So wondering if you have any, those of you working on the ground or in policy, have any sense of, is perhaps one of the long-term impacts of the COVID to see people either moving towards, more rural or suburban areas, and might that have a longer-term demographic impact?
So in our region, I'll cover that, and maybe Katherine has some larger trends. We tried to step back and look at what was the outflow of 9/11 post that tragedy and what impacts that had. More than a decade ago now, and the data is limited. What we do have now is and many people probably have seen this, is the data that of U.S. Postal Service forwarding information. And what was really interesting to me is a lot of urban people seem to go to other urban places, which means maybe that they were looking to be with loved ones. Obviously, the exodus from New York was substantive. And so that seems to be where the data is. Again, we're much more, as you say, on an anecdotal level. And what we have heard is twofold. One, before travel restrictions were put in place by governors, we were seeing an enormous number of out-of-state plates. As I said before, we have 70 million people within a day's drive, and some of the hottest COVID impacted places, even 5 hours away. So we saw that initial wave. We have seen an uptick in real estate inquiries. Some of our real estate partners are actually bashful in saying that, yeah, things are actually quite good until you get to closing, and it's much more complicated at that point. But I think that there is some hope that people will look to stay and participate in these communities longer term, post their second home nature. But again, I would go back to, they can only be there as long as the broadband capacity allows them to. And as we think about remote learning that many children across the country went into, we had places where we had to provide emergency funding for these 4 different school districts to enable, I think it was like, in one school district it was 80 students, in another it was up to 200 students, or that was aggregated among 4. But regardless, number of households who needed to have Wi-Fi enabled laptops such that their kids could study. So we do have technical limitations, and I think we do have differences of what people expect are going to be part of their normal life. The quality of education, the quality of healthcare, while good, is also different than what they might be assuming is going on. So I think the bigger frame that I'll just stop with is that I think we'll retain a few, but I think that there's going to be someone's back, and we'll see how it shakes out based upon, I think, what we have available in terms of rural housing and those conditions that I set up.
Catherine, did you want to jump in?
I'll just add one thing, and that is, to me, from a more public policy standpoint, part of the question is, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't read what's going to happen. But if there is some movement, as we've seen so far, of folks who are usually city folks moving and living in rural places, like, who benefits is part of the question that I really see as a public policy question. And certainly living here in Colorado, we have so many people who move to rural, they have second homes. It's actually creating a lot of strain in a lot of places, pushing up housing prices, making it so people who've lived in those communities for a long time, or live there because it's a place where there actually is work, maybe lower income communities, they can't live in their own communities anymore. And so there's a real public policy, but there's a need for communities to be planning and thinking about what do we need to do at the local level to make sure that our community is both welcoming to outside folks, but that ultimately that actually creates benefit for everyone. And that may mean making changes to zoning and housing type ordinances, but it also may be about community engagement, and how do you on what terms are people coming into community and invited and asked to play a role? So there's, you could talk about that from a large scale policy perspective, or a participatory democracy perspective, or a local zoning perspective. There are lots of ways to think about it. But I think this question is like, how does this not exacerbate inequity, but rather make sure that it's seen as an opportunity to generate wealth and growth and opportunity for everyone? Those are questions we have to be asking ourselves, and certainly many communities will be asking.
Yeah, I think, if you don't mind me just adding one sort of more granular point to that, is that I do think that what we know is true in many rural places is that there's a very different price quotient on real estate versus in urban areas. And for example, the town of Millinocket that I shared, I believe the current median sale price of homes in town is roughly $60,000. So for some, that looks like, cheaper than renting a storage unit. And yet that purchase will help support property values, but also will take that housing stock out of community participation, such that someone who wants to come to the community will be able to buy and live in that place. So I think, to Catherine's really good point, is that we're at this sort of tension point where communities need that influx of capital and people, and at what cost does that come? And I think that's a place where we have to really, I would say maybe it's both practice and policy. How do we think about some of the tools we have and that exacerbate the issue or help us think about a new path forward? And I would say that a lot of this is done less through policy and more on practice, because it's in the places in between where you find innovative housing developers and things like the things that we're doing. So it's a really, really good point, and a challenge and an opportunity that we're going to be facing.
So I'm wondering if I could pick up the policy side for a second, which is the question of where is rural policy actually housed, right? So of course we clearly have federal government responsibility, but also in states, virtually all states that have significant rural populations. There's clearly state level. And then from the examples that Rob's talking about, there's clearly local government level policy. I'm wondering if you can talk about how the architecture of the way or the terrain where rural policy is either an obstacle or opportunity for thinking about more robust elements, particularly, as you mentioned, Katherine, thinking through the kind of urban-rural interdependencies.
Sure, glad you asked. So I worked in the federal government for most of my career, and so I've become pretty familiar with this. And for me, the answer is both everywhere and nowhere. So technically on paper, the US Department of Agriculture, and specifically a division called Rural Development within the Department of Agriculture, is responsible for guiding and coordinating US rural policy. In practice, most policies, certainly many policies that affect rural people and places, sit far outside of the Department of Agriculture. It sits within the Department of Health and Human Services and EPA and Department of Interior and state policy, all agencies over which USDA has no jurisdiction and no authority and really very little influence. So you've seen over the course of years, various presidential administrations kind of seeing this, trying to do something, often creating a commission. There have been congressional commissions on rural policy. There was a White House Council on Rural Policy under the previous administration. Currently, there is an agriculture and rural prosperity task force, or there was one that was created and made some recommendations, not particularly active now. There are these efforts to try and create some kind of coordinated structure. But from what I've seen, they're not funded. They're not staffed. They still sit underneath the responsibility of the Secretary of Agriculture, and they rarely actually try to do the work of changing policy structures or really, they're a workaround for not really anybody being in charge. And so I think you see at the state level, there's again, lots of variation. You see some states that have taken this on. In Indiana, there's an office that sits in the Lieutenant Governor's office. There's actually an office that's getting created, that was just created in Wisconsin, an Office of Rural Prosperity, Agriculture and Rural Prosperity in the Department of Commerce. We have a Department of Local Affairs here in Colorado. Montana is doing something related to climate change, but it's a patchwork. It's different in all places. I really think this is a place where there's a huge opportunity to build on place-based efforts that the federal government has been working on and getting better at over the course of the last 10 years or so, things that are kind of rooted in collaborative governance and understanding that there's a real need to figure out how state and federal policy structures can be more responsive and more flexible to local leaders, locally driven efforts, and really support those, and in all of government, come alongside communities to support rather than this top-down structure. But there's a ton of work to do, and it's actually something I've been writing about a little bit, probably why I'm being long-winded, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I'm happy to share some of what I've put on paper. But there needs to be interagency coordination, and there needs to be proper representation at the highest levels of government. I think you see actually some of that working better for tribal communities. There is a White House Council on Tribal and Native American Affairs, and also has been a point person, at least in the previous administration, who was a pretty high level official. And those really, the value is proven of the need to coordinate in a really important way. And there are some models we can follow to do that for rural policy, but it hasn't yet been done, and definitely a place where there's lots to do.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly that my organization spans 4 states, and when thinking about rural policy in that context, think about the state of Vermont. The state of New Hampshire, we share a river boundary, and almost from a traditional governance perspective, and what you see in elected officials going back have been almost very, very, very different. You think about the scales of northern New England, compared to New York State and some of the institutional structures inherent in that. So I think that when we think about policy, we think on very geopolitical segments, whether it be states, counties, and that's not really how markets work. That's not how rural works in integration with urban areas. And I think that's one of the outdated things of our policies as it goes to these geographic districts that really don't have the same reason for being. And as you look across the country, our form of county government is very, very weak compared to many out west. So we have an imbalance of even the structures within we're working to inform and enact policy. And so I think that's where I tend to go more on the pragmatic and practical side. How do we really put in place innovations that stream up into influencing policy, but not using too much of a regulatory framework to do so, because we're working across 4 states. I also will say that I think there are some new structures that have been put in place that are imperfect, but are getting to some of this. Regional commissions. We have one in this area, the Northern Border Regional Commission. People are very familiar with the Appalachian Regional Commission. There's a Delta Regional Commission. There's a few others. Those tend to really focus on rural places with either economic transitions or persistent poverty, and try to bring different types of resources that can match other federal dollars in a more flexible way. I think that's been a newer innovation, if you will, from the federal side that I think shows some promise in terms of how we look at things.
Sure, I want to start bringing in some of the questions, and thank you for all of you that have posed the questions on the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Somebody commented saying, for example, they're from the rural Midwest, and the housing situation in parts of the rural Midwest is different than what Rob was describing in the Northeast. And there's a shortage of housing and so on and so forth there. And so one of the things, and I think this is one of the myths that kind of that Katherine was addressing earlier, is we don't want to over homogenize the rural as if the rural means the same thing kind of everywhere. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how one then thinks about crafting, and this I think relates to Katherine's point earlier, that a uniform top-down strategy is not going to be effective if you're actually dealing with different rurals. So to talk about that a little bit, and then Rob, perhaps you can talk about some of the ways in which this was developed. We have a couple of questions specifically on exactly how you expanded kind of broadband access and so forth.
So, you know, indubitably rural places are very diverse, and that's part of what we want you to take away, right? That there's not one rural, there are lots of rurals. We do need to have as I see it, we need to have a coherent federal strategy. We don't have one right now. Right now we have a lot of money that supports a lot of projects. So I like to say that we have random acts of rural development. We do lots of project-based things, but there's not an overarching strategy. And ultimately communities need to own their strategies, but those strategies don't need to be made up out of nowhere. Like, we know things about what works in development, and we know things that don't. We know that if we want to build thriving rural communities, that requires certain things. And we know some of this from our work domestically. We also know a lot of it from our work internationally. There's a field of development. There are principles we can follow, such as local ownership and local wealth creation and community ownership. And I say that in terms of both business ownership, wealth creation ownership, and also owning the vision and owning the strategy. There are principles of development that could actually be laced through all of our policy at the federal level, but still then use the tools within the, expand the federal toolbox, and then use the tools within the federal box to support communities actually both creating those visions that align with principles and also then executing on them, making them come true. So the federal government could be providing relatively large, relatively flexible funds for, say, 5 years at a time for a community, for a region that really has a strategy. So of course there are going to be projects in that strategy, right? But we're not just funding. We're not saying, hey, here's a book of federal grants, go get it. Go figure out how to patch together the parts and pieces. And if it aligns with what you want to do, great. If not, too bad. This is the money that we have right now. And that's how I see things working versus where we could really go. I see it's a chance to develop a field, like a real field of development that is modern. We've been doing development about the same way for a long time, since the 1920s. I saw someone who mentioned here in one of the questions saying economic development is often seen as harmful and met with local resistance. Well, to me, like, well, what kind of economic development? Traditional economic development is really focused on business recruitment, extraction, and tax credits, right, are often seen as like the primary tool. That's one form of economic development, but there's a different way to think about it that many communities, and I'd say this actually is part of the stories that maybe aren't being told, that a journalist who's on the line had asked, what's not being told? The stories of communities that are doing things differently. They're doing asset-based community development. They're working in a collaborative way. They're working across regions, and they're not necessarily doing it in a way that's political. It's not necessarily it's like the 10-year and 20-year and 50-year work that just isn't newsworthy for in most people's minds, because there's not necessarily friction, because it's really slow, long work. So that's answering a few people's questions at once, and hopefully yours as well, John. But there's certainly a way that we can thread this needle of more vision and more independence at the local level and more coherence federally.
Yeah, so I'm less talented at multitasking and reading questions and paying attention to what Katherine and you all are saying. So I'll try to just go to John's point. I think one thing I want to jump back on rural housing, to the comment that you read earlier, is that we do have a lack of housing. I'll say that. What we have is submarginal housing stock, deferred maintenance. It's uninhabitable in many cases. And I think that this goes to a policy issue, that the normal tool that's provided in lower income communities is lower income housing, Section 8 housing, and that's where the subsidies are. But if you look at economic growth, and you need to have a companion next to that looks at who's the first employee to the entrepreneur. Where are the people who work at the hospitals? What about the people who are working at the schools? They might be above that wage that excludes them from that public assisted housing level. And the assumption is the market will figure it out. Well, the market is not working, and that's where we have to have some of these these innovations that we've been trying to be a part of, such that we're looking for community-based housing, look at an asset-based approach to it, and trying not to be part of the problem that we see going on. I'll do two quick things here. One is refer people to the Aspen Community Strategies Group Hubs report that we were a part of, that really talks about the types of organizations that really are working on some of these. I think it was a great way to think about the features of the organizations, not the type of organizations, because we all act very differently, reflecting what we see on the ground. And I think that has some great attributes, or identifies that really goes to the adaptability and adaptive nature of organizations on the ground trying to do a lot of the things we're talking about. The second piece that comes into this, which is a huge public policy issue, as I mentioned before, and to your question, John, around broadband. This could take up 3 days, right? I think the fundamental thing that we see a challenge is currently providers and policymakers, I think, are not synced up as to where the predominant need is. Meaning, a provider can check off a box in one of our states by saying a house in a town is served, and say, check, that's been 100% served. That would make that town ineligible for accessing USDA rural development broadband funds. So by that, even just that one point of contact, it negates them from accessing public funds for whatever competitive reason it might be. But one of the things that we really try to do is how do we break this down into near-term, long-term solutions? We're talking about multi-millions of dollars for actually having a universal utility here. But the first step was, how do you actually have some community centers for Wi-Fi activity, libraries, for example, the community center? How do you have them have the most effective technology for their users and for people outside, Wi-Fi enabled hotspots? How do you have kids, now learning at home? How do you plug that gap? And then there's a broader conversation around really understanding the lay of the land with providers, public subsidies, state bonds. How do these things work together? And we're in the mix of it right now and trying to look at sub-regions. And consolidated communications districts is a tool that some people are using to allow towns to bond for that expense versus at the county or state level, which is again is parsing this down into some smaller, more focused units. But I would say to the person who's asking the question, and I think everyone probably knows this is a continual challenge of continued inequity. There are some people who can buy into it. Satellite, broadband, they can run a wire. Many other people in rural communities are just unable to do so. So we really do need a public policy that looks at universal broadband as a universal right, as a part of our utility, our infrastructure that people should have access to. So a lot more there, but I think that that gives enough to kind of touch on some of those subjects.
Great. So we're coming down to about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to ask two sets of questions based on some submissions we got. One is if you could talk a little bit about the intersection between rural development and then kind of Indian country. And so the role of Alaskan Native tribes, Native American communities, and again, the policy dimensions and intersections there. And then the second thing would be, it's an election year. We should probably at least highlight how both of you see kind of these issues playing a role or not in the 2020 election process.
All right. I just started thinking about your second question. Sorry, say your first question again. I got distracted.
Intersection of
Native
rural
Got
and
it.
Native. Yeah.
Yes.
Native American.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, because it's actually there's not an easy answer to this. As far as I see it, it's both and. Like there is policy that is decidedly different, right? Than the nation-to-nation relationship, tribal sovereignty, treaty responsibilities and rights. Like these are decidedly different. At the same time, most reservations and most tribal nations have a very strong presence in rural. And so kind of even just from an eligibility standpoint, USDA rural development programs that are made for rural communities often work quite well in Indian country, and often are made in ways so that, say, the match requirement may be only 5% or no match requirement if that funding goes to a Native American community. And certainly this means there's just adjacency and overlap. So I think it's distinct, but interrelated. And I'm always trying to figure out how we can make sure that we're bringing these together. So when people see and hear the word rural, they are thinking again that rural includes tribal nations, Native American people, and that we also continue to keep that in mind in our policy. But easier said than done. So I'll leave it at that. I'm glad you asked. But I would say, pay attention. I think it's important if you're trying to be more informed about rural America to include tribal America. You can look at Indian Country Today and the Daily Yonder as two go-to sources with reporting that is specific to those to rural and tribal communities. And as for the election and what people should be paying attention to, I guess a couple different things come to mind for me. Certainly we hear about broadband, we hear about healthcare, we hear about any number of issues that are absolutely important. What I think we don't hear enough about is the big picture and remembering that even if we had broadband and even if we have healthcare, we really need an overhaul, and we need to modernize the way we go about our rural policy. And then we need to be talking much more about the relationship between states and federal government and localities, and remembering that we've defunded, as a government, we have systematically defunded local governments while putting many more responsibilities on them since the 1980s. And that power shift is something that really needs to be revisited. That's probably not a winning issue to go talk about with people, but it is something that I think is often just missing from the framing and the conversation. The other piece of it is that rural people are smart. And they see that when folks only show up in an election year, that is very political, and rural people, real lives, rural places matter all of the time. And so I think to me, that's the other piece of this, is that it needs to be really clear that this is a long-term commitment. We as a nation need to make a real and long-term commitment to all of the places in our nation and all of the people who live in these places. And that should be evident in our policymaking. It should also be evident in the way that our parties and our political system operates and organizes.
Rob, did you want to jump in? I don't think anyone's going to have any objections if we run over a little bit.
I think Katherine really covered it, but I guess I'll just say that I think it really is, we are at a point to which we need to kind of reconstruct the system, and I think really bring these connections closer. I think people on the ground who go back and forth between rural and urban see the ease of interplay, but when we look at policy, it's segmented so significantly that it's like we really are talking about two different countries, and I think that really undervalues the sense of whole and the interdependence we have on each other. When we think about, back to some of Katherine's earlier comments, of clean air, clean water from our region, fiber, energy, recreation. I mean, I don't know how many different articles I've seen on forest bathing lately, but people need nature, and people need to be in that place to responsibly steward and serve people who come to that place for that rejuvenation. And they're not servants, they are smart people who also want to be there for a reason, and maybe are giving up some economic status to be there because they love that place. And others are stuck there because they don't have mobility out. So I think we tend to focus on that on inner cities. We don't also see that in rural places. And I do think that if we were to go through that list of challenges that face rural places, we'd probably go to many inner cities that are predominantly minority populations and see some of the same challenges too. So we do need to talk about these distinctly in some cases, but as we look about national policy, there's much more similarities across, many more opportunities to bring us together than to divide us. And I do think that in light of recent events with Black Lives Matter and the tumult across this country and across the world, I think it's important for people on this call to understand that there have been protests in the Northern Forest across many of our small communities. I'm in Concord. I participated in one last weekend with my family. It's the state capital, so it doesn't really count in the same way, but we have seen and heard and supported the solidarity of the systemic injustice of racial inequity. And that is an important thing that rural people are participating in and need to continue to participate in, or else we're going to fall into the same demagoguery that really came out of the last election. And I think that does a disservice to our country. So, I'll just say that I think it's just an important thing that we look about how we are, what brings us together. And I think that we have a political opportunity to do that. So.
Great. Well, thanks both to Katherine and Rob for a really fascinating discussion. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of the questions. I think that's a sign of just how much interest there are in this issue, and hopefully creates a good reason for us to continue these kinds of conversations and dialogues. A number of you were asking about contact information and resources, and we will be including that in a follow-up email that'll provide some links to work both from Katherine's program and from Rob's organization that'll be sent around to everyone. I'd like to also thank Andrew D'Amico from the Wagner School for enabling us technologically to make all of this work. Thank all of you for joining, and thanks again to Katherine and Rob for a really wonderful discussion.